Hello, everyone, and welcome to Inside Israel with Joel Chasnoff. That's me. It is the week of October 23rd, 2024, and I'm coming to you tonight from Stamford, Connecticut. Last night was the kickoff of my fall 2024 Yachad comedy and book tour, began in Reading, Pennsylvania. Today, had an event at Bethel in Norwalk, Connecticut. So I do want to say hello, first of all, to any new listeners we have. Anyone joining for the first time here. A lot of people signed up for the mailing list last night and today. And in case this is your first time, just to give you a little run through Inside Israel, the whole point is to give you not the news that you could hear anywhere else. So I'm not just going to run through the headlines that you could hear on CNN or MSNBC or wherever else you get your news. What I really want to do instead is give you a little bit of personal perspective from a family guy like me, someone raising four kids in Israel, living in Israel, married to an Israeli. What are we thinking? What are Israelis on the street saying about the news that's happening? And maybe even more importantly, what is the news that you're not hearing at all? What are the stories that aren't making it into the mainstream press just because they're maybe not so exciting or they're not worthy enough of headlines, but are actually telling the real story when you dig right down to it? So if this is your first time, welcome, and I hope you stick around. The way this works is every Sunday night, I do a live broadcast. Right now, because I'm on tour, it's at 9 p.m. Eastern. Although lately I've been mixing in interviews. I've had a few interviews go up already. I have more that'll be dropping in the next few weeks. The pod always drops on Wednesdays on Apple and on Spotify. And some of my upcoming guests, I mean, the one you've heard of the most is Yossi Klein Halevi. I sat with him a couple of weeks ago in his office in Jerusalem, and I know you've heard him in other places, but believe me, the stories I was able to pull out of him are stories you won't hear anywhere else. I talked to a soldier who just got out of Gaza about what it's really like to be a soldier in Gaza. Osnat Lautman is a cultural trainer who studies the Israeli psyche, and she breaks down why Israelis think and act the way they do. So those are the kind of guests that I try to bring you. But every Sunday night, no matter what, at 9 p.m. Eastern, I do this live broadcast. So welcome if this is your first time. I also want to note that this is the Sukkot holiday, and so my engineer is away this week as well. So this week's podcast, if you're listening on one of the platforms, Apple or Spotify, you're not hearing any music, nothing fancy, no jazzy transition sounds. That's because my amazing editor and engineer is away for the Sukkot holiday, but next week she will be back. All right, let's go ahead and jump right in. One of the recurring themes or phenomena of this podcast is that on Thursdays in my weekly newsletter, I announce the title and I tell you what I'm going to talk about. And lo and behold, by the time Sunday evening comes around, the subject I was going to talk about is already a little bit out of date and feels like old news. That's what it's like for Israelis as well. Every day we feel like a new tidal wave of news washes over us. Uh, and and that's one of the reasons that so many Israelis do feel disoriented right now. I've mentioned this before, but just the number of ordinary Israelis who I talk to who are telling me that they feel more anxious than usual, that their diets have changed, that they've put on weight or lost weight. Statistically, smoking is up in Israel, and demand for antidepressants and other types of emotional relieving drugs and also just appointments with therapists is at an all-time high. So a lot of that is due to just this tidal wave of news that really washes over us, not even every 24 hours, but often several times throughout the day. I am going to stick with the original content and idea of tonight's podcast, but I do have to add some other things given what else has been happening over the week. So the title of this week's pod is Exeunt Sinwar. And exeunt, that's Joel getting fancy. It's a Latin word that means exit. And a few of you wrote in saying actually exeunt refers to multiple characters exiting the stage, not just one. So that I actually made a mistake. And yeah, I guess technically, I didn't know that, by the way. So thank you for pointing it out. But technically, that is true. But the overarching reason, the reason that I chose Exeunt Sinwar as the title of the podcast was specifically because I wanted to tip my hat to the idea that this is really a drama unfolding and that we have incredible, crazy characters taking part in this drama that 50 years from now, when we look back on this period of Israeli life, we are going to see just how prominent these various characters are. Let's look at Sinwar himself, this man who grew up hating Israel as a child and spent 20 plus years in an Israeli prison, becoming fluent in Hebrew to the point where once he was back in Gaza, he was communicating with the hostages in Hebrew. He was released in a prisoner exchange in 2000 and 2010 or 11 for Gilad Shalit, the tank soldier who had been captured and held by Hamas for 5 years. He goes on to rebuild Hamas, the military wing, and he is the architect of the October 7th massacre last fall. And he proclaims himself a lion, and then 5 days ago dies the most demeaning and humiliating death, like a rat in amidst garbage in a crumbling apartment in Gaza, found with cash and a fake passport and a roll of Mentos. You can see that photo online. And on the yeah, to me, it's just it's so much larger than life. The the hatred that he exuded for Israel and the way he dedicated himself to hatred toward and violence against Israel. And in the end, he died alone in an apartment in in Gaza, not a lion, but like vermin. And then you have other characters on the Israeli side. You have the chief of staff, Herzi Halevi, who, on the one hand, he was the chief of staff on October 7th. If anyone is to blame for the army's failure to react to the intelligence that we had leading up to October 7th, it's him. And many believe that when this war is over, he will actually be the first one to step down, that he must. But at the same time, look at the campaign he has waged. Look at what Israel has accomplished since October 7th. Not just eliminating Sinwar, but also Nasrallah and Mohammed Def, and really the entire upper echelon of both Hezbollah and Hamas. One could argue that he is one of the greatest generals Israel has ever had, and yet we cannot forget the dichotomy of his career, of his identity, that he was the one who on October 6th at 3 o'clock in the morning, we're now getting reports that at 3 o'clock in the morning on October 7th, between October 6th and 7th, the Shin Bet sent information to the army saying that they were suspicious of an upcoming attack within hours, and the army chose to ignore it. That's on him. We have the Minister of Defense, Yoav Gallant. Now, throughout the past 13 months now, just about 13 months, Yoav Gallant, the Minister of Defense, has been the one person who over and over Israelis have said they trust the most. They believe he tells the truth. They believe he speaks frankly. They believe that his motives are aligned with the goal of protecting the country and not personal motives. And he was already fired. We forget this, but he was fired about 2 months before October 7th, only to be reinstated. This was during judicial reform, only to be reinstated when there was a mass uprising of the people against his firing. And then it's been talked about many, many times since then that Bibi has talked about firing him again, and even offered the Minister of Defense portfolio to Gideon Sa'ar, only to have him turn it down. So there's this real cast of characters and this Shakespearean-esque arc to the story that years from now we're going to look back on. There is Yair Levin, the deputy prime minister, who in the shadows has been trying to re-engineer Israel's justice system for many reasons, people believe to protect the prime minister himself. And then, of course, there is Bibi, and opinions run the gamut on him. I've been very clear on this podcast that it's not that I'm anti Bibi. I believe the man is a liar, and we have many instances where what he said hasn't matched what's come out as truth. But to me, one of the most disturbing examples happened in the past 2 weeks. If you may remember, right when we killed Nasrallah in Lebanon, Israel was bombing Beirut pretty much daily. And it was a major accomplishment that we took out Nasrallah in Beirut with this bunker busting series of bombs, and then we took out his second in command, and we continued to bomb all these strongholds, all these weapons that they had stored in apartment buildings. They knew that Israel wouldn't dare bomb apartment buildings where civilians resided. So instead, what we did is we notified the civilians, get out of these buildings. We're going to bomb them. And we did. And then all of a sudden, for 5 days, we stopped bombing Beirut, and no one could figure out why. And it turns out a news report came out that Bibi had made a deal with Biden. President Biden asked him to stop bombing Beirut. And so Bibi issued an order to the army saying no more bombing of Beirut unless I personally authorize it. And then when this news report came out, Bibi denied it and said it wasn't true, that there was no such agreement with Biden. But then the actual document surfaced, the actual document that Bibi had issued saying you cannot bomb Beirut unless I give the authorization. So it's a known thing to me and to many others that Netanyahu is a liar. And yet at the same time, his poll numbers recently have been going up with the killing of Nasrallah and the killing of Def and Sinwar and these other leaders of the terrorist organizations who've tried to decimate us. So you just have this really fantastic, and I don't mean the word fantastic in a positive way, but just in an awe-inspiring way, this fantastic cast of characters who we are going to look back upon when we analyze this period of Israeli life. And that's why I chose Exeunt Sinwar as the title, because one of the major characters has left the drama. The question now is what is going to change, and we'll address that in a couple of minutes. Like I said, my intention tonight was really to talk only about the killing of Sinwar in Gaza a few days ago. And we are going to, but first I need to pivot to one other story that just came out in the news today. And that is the fallen soldier Achsan Dachsa. I don't know if you heard this story. Certainly, it wouldn't strike me as mainstream in the US, but in Israel, it's very big news. Achsan Dachsa was a colonel in the IDF, and not just a colonel, but he was the head of the entire 401st Armored Brigade. Now, I myself was a tank soldier. There are actually four brigades when I was a soldier. There are four tank brigades. There was the 188th, that was the brigade I was in. There was the 500th, the 7th, and the 401st. And when I was in the Army, the 188th was the top armored brigade because it had the most sophisticated tank, the Merkava Shalosh Baz, the three Baz tank. What was unique about this tank is that it had a lock-on feature so that if your target was moving, you could lock the cannon onto the target. And even if it was a car or a helicopter or what have you, it would lock on and it would guide the missile and calculate the wind and the distance and hit it precisely. Well, since then, a newer tank has come out, the Merkava Arba, the Merkava 4. And that tank was assigned to the 401st Armored Brigade. And the head of that armored brigade was Achsan Dachsa. And what's even more remarkable is that he is Druze. He is an Arab Druze soldier who's worked his way up through the army over several decades to become the head of the 401st Armored Brigade. And it says so much, I think, about the IDF that a Druze, an Arab Druze soldier, could work their way up through their own merits to become the colonel and the head of an entire armored brigade. It also says a lot that he had an entire brigade of soldiers below him, almost all of whom were Jewish, who respected him and followed his orders as much as they would have of any colonel or any officer. Now, I actually knew Achsan Dachsa. I can't say I knew him well. He wasn't a close friend, but his number was in my cell phone. And I just looked at his number again tonight. I met him, I would say it's 4 years ago. Uh, we have an organization in the US called Friends of the IDF. In Canada, they have their own version of that organization. I think it's Canadians supporting Israel or some Canadians supporting the Israeli army. I forget what exactly the acronym is. But anyway, there was this huge dinner in Toronto, and I was the MC and the comedian that night for this fundraiser on behalf of soldiers of the IDF in Canada. And the main speaker that night was Achsan Dachsa. And I remember being captivated by his story and by how well spoken he was in English, and also how absolutely friendly he was. As a former tank soldier, I came up to him afterwards and I struck up a conversation. He was in full uniform, a dress uniform that officers have when they go to give a speech overseas. And I told them that I had kids who were going into the army soon. So clearly this was before their own army service. And they both went in 2019. So this is, I think, probably the fall of 2019, which I guess would be 5 years ago. And he said, if you need any help trying to get them in certain units, reach out to me. And he gave me his cell phone number. I mean, this is the head of the 401st Armored Brigade giving me his personal cell phone number. And he said, I'd love to host you and your family up in Dalyat Al-Carmel. He's from Dalyat Al-Carmel, a Druze town, really the capital of the Druze, in the north of Israel and the Galilee. And we talked about cooking because Dorit, my wife, is Yemenite Persian, and we talked about our favorite recipes and dishes. And he was so friendly and so Hamish, which means down to earth and grounded. And I really, really regret that I never took him up on his offer to go visit his family and hang out with him for a day in Dalyat Al-Carmel. Although I did take him up on his offer to try to help navigate the IDF system as my two oldest kids were drafted. And he put in phone calls and did what he could. And in the end, it didn't help. They both went to very good units, really without his help. But he was there and he took my calls and he was available to me. And when I saw his name today in the news that he had fallen, I mean, I knew that guy. I'd had conversations with him, and in so many ways, he represented the best of what the army is, but also the best of what Israel is. So often people forget that 20% of Israeli society is not Jewish. It's Muslim, it's Christian, it's Druze. The Druze have had a lot of soldiers sadly fall in this past year, this war in Gaza. I mentioned I was in the 188th Armored Brigade, and that has three battalions: 71st, 74th, and 53rd. And I was in the 71st. But the head of the 53rd Armored Brigade, Salman Habaka, was also Druze, and he was killed within the first month of the war. And a lot of Israelis, I think, are recognizing really two things. Number one, just how much the Druze are contributing to Israeli society in general and to the army in particular. And secondly, that we really need to do a better job of making them feel a part of and a welcome part of Israeli society. In the book I wrote that came out last year, Israel 201, I dedicate a chapter to the Druze, and I didn't just want to provide statistics and background. I really wanted to get to know them. So I went up to a school called the Darka Druze High School in Yarka in the Galilee, and I spent a day at the high school. And what's really remarkable is this high school is actually the number one high school in all of Israel. It was a failing school, but then they got this new principal who is Druze, and he used Druze values to motivate the students and to recruit the right families. And now it's the number one high school in Israel for 10 years running. And how do you measure number one high school? First of all, the number who passed the Bagrut matriculation exams, and also the number who qualify for university. And they're number one for 10 years running in both of these categories, probably 11 now. The book's already a year old. And I spoke to the principal and I spoke to the teachers, but I also got a chance to hang out with the students. And when I asked them, what's it like to be Druze in Israel? They really all said the same version of the same thing. And in Hebrew, what they said was Malgishim be'emtza. We feel in the middle. They said, on the one hand, Jews look at us as terrorists because we're Arabs. But on the other hand, a lot of Arabs look at us as traitors because we serve in the Israeli army. We feel caught in the middle. And, statistically, if you ever want to win a trivia bet, ask someone which religious group in Israel sends the highest percentage of their men to the army in Israel. Most people are going to say, well, the Jews. It's the Jewish country, it's a Jewish state. Obviously, the Jews send the highest percentage of their men to Israel, to the Israeli army. But that's actually not who it is. It's the Druze. The Druze send the highest percentage of their males to the IDF. Why is it not the Jews? Because the ultra-Orthodox do not serve in the IDF. I think that's going to change. It has to change. We've been saying now for a while that it really needs to change. Last year alone, over 60,000 ultra-Orthodox Haredi Jews got exemptions from serving in the IDF. Meanwhile, the service times have been lengthened for guys serving in the army now from 2 years, 8 months to 3 years, and the age for reserves has been raised. But it's actually the Druze and not the Jews who have the highest percentage of their men serving in the IDF. So I couldn't let this episode pass with at least acknowledging Achsan Dachsa. I can't say my friend because we weren't that close, but like I said, he was certainly available to me. His number is, in my phone. I looked at it tonight and can't believe that this same guy I had a really wonderful conversation with 5 years ago in September 2019 you know, is now no longer with us. We're going to take a very, very quick hafsaka so I can get drink some water and get my voice back, and then I'll come back and talk about the big news of Sinwar's elimination over the past week. Be back in about 20 seconds. All right, welcome back to Inside Israel. So this was the major news a few days ago until all this other major news happened. Yes, the elimination of Yahya Sinwar, the architect of the October 7th attacks. So really I don't want to regurgitate the headlines or, if you want the play-by-play of exactly what happened, you can find that in many places. What I want to give you is more of the Israeli take on it. What are Israelis on the streets saying? And I alluded to this in my newsletter from last week, but here I want to go into a little more detail. And I'm going to use some Hebrew phrasing to communicate what exactly Israelis feel about the elimination of Sinwar. And then I'm going to summarize at the end by telling you what I think is actually going to happen with another Israeli phrase. So the first phrase I want to bring up is Sgirat Ma'agal, which means closing the circle. For just about every Israeli, seeing that Sinwar was eliminated, killed, closed the circle. It brought a certain sense of closure that at least one element of this war, one mission has been completed. We knew that no matter what happened, no matter how many hostages were freed, no matter how many buildings destroyed or Hamas fighters killed, if Sinwar were able to emerge victorious and wave and make it seem like he had beaten the Zionists, then we would not have been able to declare victory. So the killing of Sinwar closes a certain circle for us and gives us that sense of finality and at least one mission of the war. The second is chalon shel hizdamnut, meaning a window of opportunity. The immediate, and I mean immediate reaction. The first hour, I was in Texas at the time. I had the Israeli news on my phone. I was watching, and everyone was talking about how finally we have this window of opportunity that we need to act now. This is our chance to get the hostages free. And everyone was basically, all the commentators were basically saying the same version, different versions of the same story, which is we're in control. Finally, the cards are in our hands. Now we can get the hostages out on our terms. We have this window of opportunity. We need to act fast, but the ball is in our court. We get to say what happens next. So there was this real feeling of optimism. They were using the lone expression game changer, game changer, that this changes the playing field completely. Even as I heard that, I didn't buy it, and I'll tell you why in a minute. But that's what everyone was feeling like. There was this sense of optimism that now we can make the deal we need to make on our terms because there is no leader on the other side. There's this obstacle who is not holding things up anymore. Even Biden said the biggest obstacle has been removed. So it looked like the hostages might finally be free. And commentators were saying what Netanyahu should do right now is say, we are prepared to leave Gaza so long as you return the hostages. Just return the hostages and this war is over. What more can we do? So with window of opportunity, chalon shel hizdamnut. The third feeling that a lot of Israelis feel is the word bilbul, which means confusion. Bilbul comes from the Tower of Babel, confusion. That on the one hand, of course, we've closed the circle with the elimination of Sinwar. But on the other hand, there's this question now of where's the address of that with whom we are negotiating? Who do we talk to now? Who is the person who will decide to release the hostages if we're going to strike a deal? Who is the one who's going to coordinate with Islamic Jihad and the families who are holding hostages? How does that happen now that Sinwar is gone? Not that anyone is saying it was a mistake to eliminate him, but okay, wait, what happens next? Who do we talk to? Because he was now the leader of the military wing and the political wing. So there's this confusion of what exactly would come next. So those were the three things that really Israelis, the three sentiments that Israelis were feeling as this happened. So what is my takeaway? My takeaway is another lone expression that you hear in Israel a lot, which is more of the same, or in English, more of the same. I personally actually don't see this changing much of anything. It certainly, like I said, gives us this sense of closure. But as all the commentators were talking about how this was a game changer and how finally we would be able to dictate the terms of the hostage release, and I didn't buy it. There was no part of me that believed that anything was really going to be different. I mean, first of all, who has any idea where the hostages actually are? I don't think even Sinwar knew where the hostages actually are. They're scattered throughout Gaza. They're being held, some by Hamas, some by Islamic Jihad, some by private families who took them as loot, as booty, or were given to them by Hamas and Islamic Jihad. The idea that there is one person we can now talk to who will say, okay, this phase is over, hostages released, it's delusional. There is no one like that. Another reason I didn't see this actually leading to a hostage release is because, frankly, I don't see Bibi wanting to. I don't see Bibi wanting to say, okay, now the war is over, hostages, release the hostages, and we withdraw from Gaza. There are military experts who believe that is what he should say, but I do not think for an instant that he would want that because the minute this war is over, his coalition falls apart and his tenure as prime minister is done. So I don't think there's a motivation by him to having the hostages released, at least not on those terms. So for various reasons, I really don't see this changing much of anything. Now, as I've said before on this pod, I really hope I'm wrong. I would love it if, next week, 2 weeks from now, I came back and I were able to say, man, I was totally wrong on that. Thank God the hostages are home. But I just don't see it happening. And if anyone can posit a theory for how it actually would happen, I'd love to hear it. But man, I just don't think it's possible. I certainly think, well, certainly not by the American elections on November 5th. I would imagine not even by Thanksgiving and not even by January 1 are we going to see another hostage released unless it's by some miraculous rescue. I just I can't imagine the scenario where it would actually benefit either side. I mean, how does it benefit Hamas at this point to release hostages? What is in it for them? I just, if you don't see the benefits, you can't really envision it happening. So I think the biggest achievement here is that we've symbolically removed the leader and we've shown Hamas and the rest of the Arab world that we will hunt down those who attack us. But in terms of actually getting the hostages back, which the majority of Israelis, I think 70% of Israelis right now feel should be the number one goal, I just don't see it happening. Again, I hope I'm wrong, but I can't envision that scenario, at least not yet. In terms of your questions this week, there were quite a bit of questions, but they were all answered in the context of what I spoke about, whether it was what's going to change now that Sinwar has been eliminated, and do I think the hostages will be released, and what are Israelis saying about Sinwar's being killed? So the questions, in a sense, were already answered, even though I didn't read them aloud. So that concludes this week's episode of Inside Israel. If you know someone else who would enjoy the pod, again, you can go to joelchasnoff.com/podcast. That's where you can get the links that go out every Thursday in the Hebrew is Magic newsletter. The next episode is going to take place on, again, next Sunday night at 9 p.m. Eastern Time. I'll be broadcasting from Jacksonville, Florida. So as I tour the pod tours as well, if we have anyone in Jacksonville or that area, I'll be doing two events there. Next Saturday night is a comedy night with Benji Lovett, and next Monday night, the 28th, is a book night at the JCA, the Jacksonville Community Association, the Jewish Community Association of Jacksonville. That's, I believe, at 8 p.m. at the JCA on Monday, the 28th. So come on out and say hi. Thank you for joining tonight. Again, if you have questions, you can always send them to joel@joelchasnoff.com or reach me through the podcast page, joelchasnoff.com/podcast. I will see you next week at 9 p.m. Eastern Time for the live broadcast. Thanks for joining, everyone.